Live from the studio, I'm Jimmy Selesky. We don't really actually know what it means to be conscious. What we do know is that the same dust and elements and gases and whatever that have existed in the universe for billions of years have for some reason patterned themselves into these things, life forms, that are able to like be self-aware. And so in that way, like, yes, if you're made of the universe, if I'm made of the universe, we're made of the same stuff. We're not like outsiders. We're not like guests to the party. Like the same things that make up the sun and the stars, and not to sound all Duncan Trussell on you, man. We're the same thing, man. We're made of the same stuff. The stars and the dust and this cosmic like crazy thing, man. I'm not trying to get all like that on you. I'm just saying objectively that is true, man. And so sometimes that dust and other stuff forms together and it creates planets or stars or whatever. And sometimes it patterns itself into us or other living beings. And those living beings, including ourselves, are able to experience the world around us. Or so we think. Rene Descartes is most famous for his saying, "I think, therefore I am." And I never really understood that saying as a kid because it's not really something you think about when you're a kid, I guess. Rene Descartes. But what Rene Descartes meant when he said that was, in his meditations, he wrote that he was striving to figure out the one thing that he knew for certain. He's basically saying that all the things that we believe we know are really just varying levels of beliefs. And this is not unique to his philosophy. This is what Socrates said and Plato and all those guys. We're giving credit to the Greeks where credit is due. And I'm sure people said it before then, but who cares? We're going Greek. That all the things you think you know are really just things that you really strongly believe. And so Rene Descartes' question was, is there anything that I definitely know for certain? And he was able to come up with one thing. And what he discovered was not that I have a body and hands, because those hands could be an illusion. Your body could be a delusion. Your brain could be telling you that you have hands, and you could be imagining. You could be imagining just like when you're in a dream and you're talking to somebody else. And when you're asleep, it really makes sense that you're, hanging upside down in a spaceship underwater talking to your dead dog's grandmother. And you're like, yeah, man, this makes perfect sense. This is a dream. And, you talk to your friend in your dream and you really think you're talking to your friend. But you're not. You're talking to yourself. And your brain has concocted this illusion, this caricature of your friend. And you don't even know that it's really just you talking to yourself through the hologram or whatever you want to call it of your friend. And this makes sense, perfect sense, right up to the moment that you wake up. And then you realize it was a dream. And then you're like, yeah, man, that was crazy. Wasn't crazy while you were in the middle of it. It was only crazy once you woke up. So Rene Descartes, following that logic, was like, well, who's to say that that's not the case right now? Who's to say that my mind isn't playing a trick on me? That my experience of myself and the people around me and the world around me could all just be a delusion, that it might not be real. So I don't really know for sure that that's not the case. I very strongly believe that my life and my experience is real. I very strongly believe that I am real and the people that I meet are real. I strongly, strongly, strongly believe that, but I don't know for sure. I can't say I know for sure. I can't say for sure that there's not a point where I quote unquote figuratively wake up and realize that it was all somewhat of a dream, a delusion of reality, and not reality at all. So he tossed all that aside and he said, okay, well, what do I know? And he came to one singular conclusion, the one thing he knew. And the one thing he knew is, well, it's got to be a fact that there is something that is thinking this thought right now. Like I'm sitting here, I'm trying to think of things I know. There is something in the universe that is experiencing this moment right now as me thinking about what I know. There is something in the universe that is experiencing itself as Rene Descartes, or in this case, there is something in this universe that is experiencing itself as Jimmy Selesky, hosting a podcast. Now, I can't say for certain that that is the case, that this isn't some weird kind of delusion, but I know for a fact that something is having some experience right now. So he said, I think, therefore I am. I am thinking right now, therefore I exist. Something exists. Whatever I am, it does exist. Something exists. Because if nothing exists, then there will be nothing to experience this experience I'm experiencing. And that's the only thing he knew for certain. And I think that's a good philosophical standpoint to begin from. Because in reality, Descartes was right. It is the only thing any of us know for certain. And therein lies the fundamental problem with science versus philosophy or religion or whatever. You see, science deals in the discovery of observable reality. I say this all the time on this podcast / show. I try to call it a show. But Isaac Newton did not invent gravity. This may surprise you, but an apple fell from an apple tree at the same rate, 9.81 meters per second squared, to the earth, long before Isaac Newton ever noticed it and figured out why. Things weren't just suspended in midair until scientists went, gravity. And then everything was like, oh, thank God I can fall now. Everything already fell. Nothing changed in the universe, in the workings of the universe, before and after we discovered gravity. Same with electricity. Nobody invented electricity, okay? Electricity exists. Electromagnetism is one of the 4 fundamental forces of physics, along with gravity and then the boringly named strong force and weak force, which we're not going to get into because they're boring. But electricity, that exists, dude. That's always existed. Nobody invented it. We discovered it. That's what science is. In the same vein that an apple fell from the apple tree at the same rate to the earth at 9.81 meters per second, and it did that long before Isaac Newton noticed, and it did that even longer before we even came up with the idea of a meter and a second. These are all things that we kind of made up. If you think about it, we decided a meter was this. We decided a second was that. We decided the number 9 means this, but in the grand scheme of things, this is just a language that we use to communicate between each other. The workings of the universe. The universe doesn't care what the number 9 means. The universe isn't sitting there and be like, oh, you're saying it's 9? I thought I was gonna do it at 8 meters per second. The universe is like, dude, call it whatever the hell you want. Because we're already doing this shit. You're just like figuring out and giving us nice little names. It's like science is like fan fiction for the universe. It's like, and I think this one is going to be like that. And he likes her. It's kind of cute. That is the word I will use. It is kind of adorable that we human beings believe that we are ever going to get to the fundamental truth of our existence through observable, measurable reality alone. And I know all the geniuses out there are sitting there scoffing, this guy doesn't believe in science, dude. I do believe in science. I believe in science. Keyword, believe. That's an important word. You believe in science, but let's examine why I stress the word believe. I was in college at one point, briefly. I've been 19 before. I've been that age where I'm not quite an adult, but not quite a kid, and I've assumed I knew everything. That's why I was on Reddit, because that's where everyone who assumes they know everything gravitates to, particularly the subreddit r/atheism, which I was a member. And in that subreddit, you had all kinds of people from all walks of life. And you, according to them, I would say the average IQ in that group was what? Minimum 192? Just geniuses that had all come to the revolutionary realization that, like, I don't know, that the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible isn't literal. Like, whoa, dude, crazy. How did you figure that one out? I also was in 7th grade and realized that as well. But nonetheless, they love laughing at the blind faith of religious people. This is a common meme that you would see is the Christian circular logic, where they'd say, you talk to a Christian and they have this self-referential sort of thinking where one thing is true because the other thing is true, and the reason the other thing is true is because the first thing is true. So it's like, all right, well, how do you know God is real? And a Christian will be like, because it's in the Bible. And they'll be like, okay, but how do you know the Bible is like true? And they'll be like, because it's the word of God. And then you'll be like, but how do you know the word of God? How do you know God is because it's in the Bible? And it just keeps going back and forth, back and forth. This is true because of that. That's true because of this. And there's no getting out of it. It's circular logic. It's self-referential logic. And what you realize is that if you really think about it, there's 2 flaws in science and the science-minded way of thinking. I'll talk about the self-referential aspect of it in just a moment because that's really where the conversation is going. That's going to be the meat and potatoes of this discussion. But before I do, let's just address the other elephant in the room, perhaps the biggest elephant in the room, which was very aptly stated by a British author whose name I do not recall, Rupert something, whatever. I was going to say Rupert Holmes, and I'm pretty sure that's the Pina Colada song guy. So sorry, dude. Sheldrake? I don't know. He said, science has basically stated, and I'm paraphrasing here, grant us one miracle and we'll explain the rest. And of course, what he's alluding to is that the science-minded theory for the creation of the universe is the famous Big Bang Theory. And the Big Bang Theory suggests that at one point, 14.8 billion years ago, or however long the universe has existed, all the things in the known universe that we have today were all condensed and compressed into this one infinitesimally small, infinitely dense, singular little, call it a particle or a speck, just this one little singularity that contained all the energy and matter in the known universe. And then at one point, it just exploded. And from that point forward, we can explain every single thing in the universe pretty much. We know gravity, we know electromagnetism, we understand atoms and electrons and photons and time-space dilation, all these other things. We understand all these things. But there's one teeny, tiny, teensy little problem. And that, of course, is, well, where did the little speck come from? And science goes, there's like fluctuations in the fabric of the universe and energy dilations, and it just, whatever, dude, whatever. It was this one little, like that happened in the first trillionth of a second, and everything after that first trillionth of a second, we get it. So if you really want to get hung up on the minutia of this 1 trillionth of a second moment that we can't quite explain.
This is an official bug intermission. No lightning bugs were harmed in the making of this video. We now return to our previously scheduled programming.
They just say stuff. They don't really know. They don't really actually know. And anyone who tells you they do know is lying. Or they just have a theory. They have a theory. And that theory is probably wrong. Why? Because it is impossible to explain through science how something came from nothing. This is an inherent reality of basic logic. You don't even have to examine the problem itself to understand that at a certain point, the fact that anything exists at all is a paradox. We cannot conceive of infinity. Now, infinity means something that has not only no end, but also no beginning. And something having no end is still technically impossible to conceive of, but it feels a little bit easier if you try. Like if you try to think about something having no end, you could just be like, okay, well, let me just picture like this thing now, and let me just imagine it just never stops being there. And in a way, you've kind of conceptualized it a little bit, even though you really don't have a concept of it, but it's kind of like, okay, it's just there and then never stops being there. Great. What you cannot even begin to understand if you really think about it is the idea that something just always was. There was never a point when it didn't exist. It always was. It had no beginning. There is no beginning. There is no point zero. It just always was. There is no way to logically explain that. But again, the science-minded people will sit there and go, look, okay, we have some theories on fluctuations in the thing and energy fields and stuff. But what you notice is that at every step of the way that they begin to try to explain how this thing came from nothing, they wind up explaining something else. Get it? So when they try to explain where this one little singularity thing that exploded from the Big Bang came from, they immediately revert to talking about something else. Notice at no point do they ever say there was nothing and then there was something. They're always talking about fluctuations in energy fields. It's like, where did the energy fields come from? What was there to fluctuate? How did that get there? There is no way to explain it. And that's why I think it's adorable that we think we can. Using science, that is. Science is inherently self-referential, just like religion, which is why you may have noticed that so many people abide by science with the same religious fervor as you would expect from someone who is a devout religious person. I believe in logic and reason and science, and don't question the science. Trust the science. Okay, I'm pretty sure the whole purpose of science is literally to question what is known, to discover the unknown. So it's an inherently anti-science thing or sentiment to discourage questioning of science. That's literally the point of science. If nobody questioned the status quo, we'd still believe a lot of stupid shit that we have since proven wrong because of science, even though previous to that, the previous dumb shit we thought we knew was also considered science of the time. And the reason I say that science is inherently self-referential is because the precise methodology of science is its very own limitation. Let me explain that. The methodology of science, again, is the sense-making of our observable reality. In order for something to be considered scientifically proven, you must be able to demonstrate it and replicate it so that you can show this is how this thing works. I performed this experiment in order to prove it. This is an experiment that you can perform as well, and you'll get the same results because this is how this works. And now that is a scientific fact. This is how this works, and here's how we proved it. But the issue with dealing in observable reality and believing that anything that cannot be shown in the confines of our observable reality is not science and therefore is not true or factual or worthy of any intellectual consideration, well, that appears to be a limitation of science. Because going back to Rene Descartes, how do we know that what we are observing is real? And here's the answer. We don't. We very strongly believe it is. It's very convincing. It's very convincing that this is real. But if you ask me if I know it for sure, the answer is no. And if you're being honest with yourself, the answer is no for all of us. So we very strongly believe that our experience of the world around us, our observations are in fact real. And going off of that assumption, which is a pretty big assumption, and then, of course, not forgetting about the other thing that we've wholly ignored, which is, well, at the end of the day, we can't quite explain why anything exists at all. But given the fact that it does, we can explain everything else, assuming that everything we're seeing and experiencing right now is real. So now we have one massive, completely ignored thing and one almost equally massive assumption. And then we arrive to science. And so the prevailing thought in science is kind of the intuitive way of thinking that not just most scientists, but most people in general, again, this isn't everyone, but most people perceive of the universe as this gigantic, almost infinitely large place in which we are just a speck of dust somewhere, not even in the middle of it, just somewhere in it. And on this speck of dust called planet Earth, revolving around a star that's not even that big called the sun, which is revolving around a galaxy, which is, not even that big compared to other galaxies. And, in the midst of all this, there just happen to be these life forms, the only life forms that we're aware of in the entire universe at the moment, so they say. And we are conscious beings, and we're able to perceive of ourselves. We're able to actually perceive the universe around us. We're actually able to see the stars and know we're on planet Earth and look around and measure things and check things and test things. And for some reason, that's just the case. And but it doesn't require that there's a conscious observer of the universe. The universe is here regardless. The universe was here well before there was ever anybody around to notice it, essentially. Essentially, science, the prevailing thought is, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, yes, it does make a sound. It doesn't matter that no one was around to hear it. It makes a sound. And so that idea makes sense. It seems obvious almost that that's the case, right? But again, it's not really something we know. It's just something we strongly believe. And if you asked that person to explain how they, quote, know this, that the universe is this gigantic, infinitely large place where we just exist somewhere in the midst of it, just consciously aware of it and looking at stuff and watching things happen and just kind of along for the ride. How do we know that that's the case and maybe not the other way around? Not that consciousness exists in the middle of the universe just as kind of like a bonus, like, oh, sweet, we got all this shit, and turns out now we got some people to notice it. How nice is that? How convenient. But rather, what if the universe exists because of consciousness? That consciousness is the fundamental nature of our existence, and the universe is a byproduct of that. And of course, a scientist would say, well, that is not what we observe when we look around us and we see the world around us. Clearly we're in the middle of it. And you go, okay, but how do you know that your observation is accurate? And they'll be like, well, because we've used mathematics and replicable experiments and data and logic and reasoning to basically determine that this is the case. And you'd be like, okay, but how do you know that your logic and reasoning and mathematics and all of the above are based in reality? And they'd be like, well, because that's what we're observing. We're observing this and then we're proving it with math. And there you get back to the same circular logic. How do you know God is real? Because he's in the Bible. Well, how do you know the Bible is right? Because God wrote it. How do you know that what you observe around you is real? Well, because it's what our equations show. Well, how do you know your equations are true? Because they replicate what we observe. Doesn't seem to be a way to break out of that. It almost seems like you're stuck in a thought loop where the alternative version of reality doesn't even exist as a possibility in your current pursuit. But if we entertained for a moment that alternate version of reality, that version of reality where it is actually consciousness that is the fundamental canvas for all of existence, and that time and space, all of the things and stuff and energy and forces in the universe that exist because they are being perceived by a consciousness and not the other way around. Well, that seems kind of trippy. It almost seems like I'm going down my Duncan Trussell, man, thing again, but I'm not, I promise. I'm just wagering to say that if that were the case, we would really have no way of knowing it, as long as we pursued the question from the angle of what we can provably observe. Because what we can provably observe is always going to be limited by ourselves. And that is a massive limitation. If you think just about your five senses, your five senses are the only way that you take in any information about the world around you. Consciously, that is. Sight, smell, touch, feel, hearing. You hear sound waves, you see light waves, you smell, you feel electromagnetic impulses and repulsion things. And all these things are translated in your brain to kind of composite a sort of simulated version of reality. You realize you see in two dimensions, right? It's the reason why you can watch this show on a computer screen or a TV or your phone, and you still see it the same way you would see it if you were standing right here. You still see the depth perception, everything. That's because even when you're walking around in real life, we all acknowledge we live in a 3D spatial world, but you see in 2 dimensions. You see the world around you like a 2-dimensional flat picture. The reason why you can perceive of something being further or closer to you is simply because of the lighting and shading, the same way that somebody could paint a picture and you could perceive that this tree is further back than this tree, even though it's on the same canvas. The tree's not literally back there. They just painted it that way by making it slightly smaller and slightly darker and having the light hit it this way. The same way you perceive it on a screen, like I just said. And you can perceive that the mic's here and I'm here. But in reality, this whole image that you're watching right now is flat on a screen. Your brain doesn't perceive it that way, even when you see it in real life. But that is what you're seeing. And speaking of sight, you can only see within a certain range of the light spectrum. There are frequencies of light that you cannot see, X-rays, gamma rays, things like that. Those, you can't see those. There are sound frequencies you can't hear. The average human being cannot hear below 20 hertz, 20 vibrations per second, and cannot hear above 20,000 hertz, 20,000 vibrations per second. Ever heard of the term a dog whistle? That's a whistle that's in such a high pitch that the human ear cannot hear it. The sound is there, you just don't sense it. Your dog can. And so these are just mundane examples of just things just even slightly out of the realm of our senses, much less all the nature of the universe that exists outside of senses we don't even have. If you try to think of a sense you could have, it's almost hard to imagine one that you don't already have. It's incredibly difficult to perceive that there might be any other sense that you would need to live your daily life. And the fact of the matter is, there probably isn't. That's why we evolved this way. Not every animal even has this many senses. Some animals are able to perform without being able to see. Some animals are able to exist without being able to hear. Human beings happen to have 5 senses. We happen to be able to see a certain frequency of light spectrum. We happen to be able to hear a certain frequency of this. And basically anything that is not immediately necessary for our survival and reproduction is not a sense that we have. And so therein lies the limitation of how we can perceive of the universe around us. We see the world around us like some 2-dimensional TV screen hologram that we perceive as depth perception, everything like this. We hear sounds. And we use those senses to then perform measurements, not on the universe, because we only have our limitation of 5 senses to even know what the universe is that we're measuring. No, we're simply measuring what we can see. And that seems cool as long as you assume that all that you can see is all that there is. But once you let go of that belief, that assumption, and you realize that there's no way to know if that's the case. In fact, everything that we're showing in science is showing that that's obviously not the case. Then, in the same way your perceptions have their limitations, therefore then must your observations have their limitations. And therefore then to rely solely on what you can observe and prove and measure is a fool's endeavor. If you have not incorporated for the idea of something existing beyond your perception that is the cause of everything we're experiencing, if the universe is not how we see it, it is not some vastly large infinite space that we're just floating around in, that actually it is consciousness that exists, and it is consciousness that is watching itself through conscious beings, which are limited by their own 5 senses. In our case, the human brain only has its 5 senses. We're only able to think to a certain degree. We're only able to make sense of certain things. There's things we cannot understand, like the idea of infinity. We literally cannot understand how something came from nothing, how something always was, and something always will be. We just can't conceive of it. We are able to perceive of the world through a vastly limited bandwidth of what exists in reality. And so consciousness is now limited by this brain, which has created a sort of simulated version of reality to the best of its ability. This light spectrum with a two-dimensional simulation of what goes on around you, and we're able to sense sounds and feel things and smell things, and that's all the consciousness that's seeing itself through your brain is able to piece together. And then you throw in that whatever consciousness is existing through you has only ever been you, and therefore perceives itself that it is you. It's never been anything else as far as it knows. Although it could very well be that the same consciousness that is seeing itself as me, experiencing itself as me, is the same consciousness experiencing itself as you. Except in that case, it happens to be limited in the vessel of your brain and your body and your experiences in your life. And so we are unable to see that we're actually just like a dream, really the same consciousness communicating with each other through a different vessel. And that the world we see, quote unquote, around us is actually a simulation that we've created within us. That we do not exist in the universe, that the universe exists in us. And as science progresses to the point where we are reaching the limits of our material world, we've gotten so far as to identify the smallest possible things that make up matter. And it's not atoms, and it's not the protons and neutrons and electrons inside the atoms like we were taught in high school. It's actually even smaller than that. They're called little quarks, and they actually vibrate back and forth to make a proton. And those quarks are, as far as we know, the smallest possible units of anything in the universe that create the protons and neutrons, that create the atoms, that create all the elements, that create all the things we see in the universe. But what are those quarks made out of? Well, we don't really know. And we don't really know how they exist or why. And we know that there is such thing as a smallest unit of time. It doesn't go on forever. There is, by definition, the smallest distance that can be traveled in the universe, and you cannot come up with any unit smaller than that, and that is 0.33001 centimeters. So very small. 0.33 zeros and then 1 centimeter. That's like 1 nonillionth, a ridiculously small amount. But the fact that there is a limit called the Planck length, and that we know that the fastest you can travel in this time-space dimension is the speed of light, and therefore the amount of time it takes light to travel that infinitely small thing called the Planck length is what we call the Planck time, because that's the shortest unit of time that exists in the universe. You cannot slice a moment up into infinity. There is a smallest possible moment. It shows that there are finite limits to our universe. And the fact that those finite limitations exist, that there is a smallest thing that can exist and nothing could be smaller than it, and there's the smallest unit of time, and all these things, and these things that you would think would be infinite are not actually infinite. And then you realize, wait a second, if our physical world is finite, then it does have a beginning and it does have an end. And that simply doesn't make sense, because obviously at some point it had to begin. So whatever existed that always is and always was is not a part of this physical universe. Whatever the infinite thing is that made it possible for this finite thing, our universe, to exist, that must be the fundamental force of existence. That must be the cause of the universe, therefore, and not the other way around. How could it be that it exists because of the universe and not that the universe exists because of it? Obviously, it wouldn't make sense. Obviously, the universe, our physical reality, is a manifestation of something outside of our physical reality. And so now we're getting to the point where we're actually logically able to conceive, at least I just made a pretty solid attempt at it, that if something finite exists, then it must be as the result of something that is not finite. And if that thing that is not finite is not our universe, then that would mean that whatever it is that is infinite is outside of our universe, or not outside of our universe, but the fundamental basis that allows for the birth of our universe, or the creation of anything, that is. And so now you're going, okay, is he saying that that's God? Maybe, sure. But what is God? Well, I was saying earlier that we were talking about consciousness. Okay, consciousness. Well, what if the reason why our universe is finite is because we will never be able to experience it as anything other than finite, because our brains cannot conceive of anything beyond it? Not that we exist in the world, but that the world exists in us. And that has some massive ramifications. That have some massive kind of mind-bending elements to it that seem to contradict everything we believe. But as Rene Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. The only thing I can say for certain is that something exists to be conscious of its own existence. So it turns out, folks, that consciousness is the only truly knowable thing in the universe. Everything else is just a hunch. Till next time, my name is Jimmy Selesky. Please leave us a subscription, leave us a like, leave us a comment, tell a friend to tell a friend. Peace.